are. Week 3 of 3 weeks. So just a reminder of where we've been and a look at where we're going for today. So week 1, we did the basic history of the region, multiple narratives, how there are different narratives and people tend to talk past each other, describe things in very different ways. We talked about the development of Palestinians as a national identity, where before that hadn't really been a Palestinian identity. The word Palestine was there, but there wasn't an Arab people in the same way to develop that Palestinian identity, but we affirm that that is their identity. We talked about Israelis' identity being rooted in their heritage. Last week we also talked about use of words like apartheid and colonialism to describe Israeli policies and practices. And we talked about how this language tends to shift the paradigm from that of being a geopolitical conflict happening there between two nationalist people into being a way of talking about it as there being a villain and a victim. So today we're going to go more into some Presbyterian documents and talk about some things that have happened and things that are coming up in Presbyterian documents. This is a picture of the National General Assembly, which happens every 2 years. People come together. Now, because of the pandemic, we're learning to do it in different ways, where some of it this year will be people in person and some will be online. And in 2020, it was all online. So, but this is from 2014, a very significant General Assembly based on our conversation here. That was the year that a divestment overture was passed. So we'll get into the details of that. Our goals today are to learn about some definitions of anti-Semitism as it relates to Israel and Zion. This is a very, Zionism. This is a very hot topic. So we'll look into some of those definitions and examine some Presbyterian documents. So how we talk about the conflict matters. This week I was chatting with someone and the topic came up and the person said to me, well, Israel went into Palestine and stole the land, they need to leave. And this is related to the idea that Israel is a colonial project and that the Israelis are all colonists coming from outside, they're outsiders, and they're coming to take the resources of the people who were already there. So to that point, I have mentioned, but want to say again, that more than half of Israelis are Arab Jews. So this is an identity of Jews who are not from Europe, Jews who are from Iraq, Iran, from all the, maybe not Iran, I'm not sure, a lot of those Middle Eastern countries around there. And they're often referred to as Sephardic Jews. Jews coming from Europe are often referred to as Ashkenazi Jews. So with over half the Jewish people in Israel being Arab Jews, it puts a different paradigm around the idea that the Jews are all outsiders coming in. And many of those Jews from the Arab countries have experienced oppression in the Arab countries and have immigrated into Israel. So I showed a video last week of a Jewish settler who has, over the course of his life, expanded his view beyond his own self-interest, and he has taken to working with Palestinians so that the Palestinians and Israelis talking in this organization learn to understand and affirm each people's right, the other people's right to be in the land, and laying the pre-political groundwork for peace, which is mutual understanding and to come to have compassion and respect for each other, rather than spinning and violence and retaliation and hatred and not knowing each other as neighbors. I showed that video not to say that I believe there are religious reasons for Jews having a right to that land. I am not lifting that up. I don't believe there are religious reasons. I think this is a geopolitical conflict. and there are peoples who have peoplehood, who have heritage in the same land, and they are the ones who are going to have to work out how to live together in that land. I wanted to clarify that because sometimes we can get pushed into the two narratives, and if I bring up a concern about anti-Semitism, for example, I can get pushed into the side and people say, well, if you're worried about that, if you're talking about anti-Semitism, then clearly you don't care about the Palestinians and their well-being. And that is a false dichotomy that I don't want to be pushed into, and I'm going to push back out of it and say we can do both. We can care about Jews and we can care about anti-Semitism, we can learn about it, we can make sure we're not participating in it, and we can learn about Palestinian suffering, the things that are human rights abuses happening there. We can do both. We can care about both people. I also want to say that many of the Jews who founded Israel were secular Jews. They were not religious Jews. So we can also get caught up in this idea that it's the extremist Jewish Orthodox settlers who believe they have a biblical right to the land. They're the Zionists, and those biblical reasons are the reason for Israel. That's not true. A lot of the founders of Israel were secular Jews, Jews who had a sense of their peoplehood, their identity as Jews, but and aren't claiming any biblical claim on the land. They're claiming a historical heritage, a sense that that is where Jews, Hebrews, Israelites, to use some ancient language, it's where they feel home. So I just wanted to clarify a few of those things about prior weeks, particularly last week. So thinking about Jews being in the land, this idea that they're all colonists who've come in is gathering steam. It's getting a lot more power in the discourse. So I wanted to take a look at some Jews who had been in the land earlier. In particular, looking back to 1929. There was something in Hebron that happened, well, throughout the region, called the Palestine riots. And in Hebron in particular, there was the Hebron massacre. Again, there are links to this in the handout, but if you look for 1929 Palestine riots or 1929 Hebron massacre, you can read about this. And this is when Arabs in that region went into Hebron and other cities and killed Jews. This is a picture of a synagogue that was destroyed during the riots, the massacre in Hebron in particular. At that time, during a week of riots, there were 133 Jews killed by Arabs, 339 Jews injured, most of whom were unarmed. There were also 116 Arabs killed and at least 232 wounded, mostly by the Mandate police, who were the police force at the time, who were trying to stop the Arabs from killing more Jews. So the Arabs, most of the Arabs who died in this uprising, this massacre, were killed in an attempt to stop them from killing more. They were killed, interrupted in their attack on the Jewish residents. The fact that this attack happened is not any excuse for any future violence against Arabs. Two wrongs don't make a right. So I lift this up, not to give any justification for future violence, but because this is part of the story. If we don't tell this part of the story too, then we're not telling the whole story. If we're just talking about European Jews coming in, we're not talking about the Jews who lived in Hebron for centuries. Hebron is where the tomb of the ancestors is. The tomb of Abraham and Sarah is there in Hebron. So many of the Jews living there in Hebron were Sephardic Jews, Middle Eastern Arabic Jews. But there were some Ashkenazi Jews there who had been there for at least 100 years, who'd moved there in the 1800s. And so in 1929, this uprising happened, and if you read about why did this happen, there were rumors about Jews trying to take control of Jerusalem, I think. There was a concern that too many Jews would come. And so the reaction to this the reaction to this was, more fear and Jewish people gathering together and building up their resistance to this kind of attack. The massacre was terrible. There's a Scottish missionary who described it, how, I'm not going to describe it because it's very gruesome, how they attacked and hurt people, women, men, children. But you can read about it on Wikipedia if you look up 1929 massacre. Hebron massacre. Here's a picture of a Jewish home. I'm just showing you the property because showing the pictures of the people is too gruesome. This is a Jewish house that was destroyed in 1929. So after 1929, a few Jews returned to Hebron in 1931 to try to resettle it. But by the late 30s, all the Jews again had left because it was too dangerous. They were under too much attack and danger there in Hebron at that time. And if we think about our dates, that's late 30s. Israel was formed in 1948. Now, another piece of the story is that at the time of the Hebron massacre, there were Arabs who protected Jews. There were Arabs who took them into their homes, who were neighbors to them. And this too is possible, and this is the kind of thing that we want to try to work for more of. Remember this slide? This is from the history video. The narrator was talking about how extremists on both sides want violence because this allows some people to have power. The extremists don't want to compromise. They want all the land from the river to the sea. That's the phrase, from the Jordan River to the sea. All the land for our people, not your people. But there are many moderates who do want peace. And there are many different solutions and things that could be worked out. But every time the violence comes, it makes the people afraid. It turns moderates more extreme. It makes them more reactionary against the people who are being violent. So, thinking about how that violence creates traumas, I want to talk a little bit about the trauma that contribute to the current conflict. So we've talked a little bit about trauma in the Arab countries where many Jews were living, and how the injustices and the expulsions there contributed to the trauma and to the movement into the Israeli territories when they got developed. Very often, World War II and the Holocaust is named. And this part of the story is very important. When the Holocaust happened, and 7 million Jews, was it 9 million Jews, were killed there, yes, there was a stronger desire to have a safe place, a realization that Jews needed a safe place. But that's not the only factor. And if we say that's the only factor, that reinforces this idea that all the Jews are European Jews who came because of the Holocaust, and the Palestinians are paying the price for what the Europeans did. There's a piece of the truth, but it's not the whole truth. There's also trauma within Palestine that we just talked about. The 1929 massacres. There was also violence and uprisings in 1920. You can see it on the handout if you want to look for some links. And then the Second Intifada also turned more moderate Israelis into more extreme Israelis. So you might remember that in the Vox history video they said it was at this point with the Second Intifada, this is when there were more bus bombings and the suicide vests and restaurants being bombed, random violence that terrorized the people. And the history video points out this was the time they suggested when Israel stopped trying to resolve the crisis and started managing the crisis. And this was when the wall started getting built. To think about the immigration from the Arab countries, remember this slide from earlier, 1948, on the date of the founding of Israel. There were, in this middle column, these were the Jews living in all those Arab countries. By 2005, Algeria from 140,000 to 0. Egypt, 75,000 to 100. Iraq, 135 to 60. Lebanon, Libya, Morocco, Syria, Tunisia, Yemen. These are also all Jews, Arab Jews, who many of them, maybe most of them, live in Israel now. And again, none of this justifies subsequent human rights abuses. This is just part of the geopolitical conflict of two peoples fighting with each other and hurting each other. There's not a simple villain. There's not a clear-cut victim. But there is a struggle with human rights abuses and tragedies and traumas, a lot of them. So in the Second Intifada, 2000 to 2005, one place said 2008. And as I mentioned, the wall, the security barrier, the wall, sometimes called now the apartheid wall as people get into using the apartheid language, starting to divide the Palestinian territories from Israel. But part of the problem is the location of where that wall is being placed. Some of it is not a wall, but is a security fence. And here's a graphic talking about that. In the more rural areas, it tends to be more fences, but they have electronic surveillance and cameras triggering and letting people know if this fence get breached. But around the cities, it's big walls like this. And here's a map painted on the wall, which is, I thought, a great idea to get the word out. And the red lines and the black lines are where the wall is or where it's projected that the wall will be. And you see the gray area is the West Bank, and so you can see where the wall starts cutting into the territories that were designated for the future Palestinian state. And Israel is, by placing the wall in these locations, basically taking land without having to negotiate for it. Maybe some of this would have been negotiated if peace talks had gone forward, but Israel is now leaping over that and saying they have no partner because of the violence of the Palestinians, and they both say they don't have any partner for peace. But this is part of the problem with the wall. In addition to how when it cuts into Palestinian territories like that, it cuts Palestinian towns in half sometimes. It separates Palestinians from their olive trees, from their crops, from their livelihood. So there are lots of reasons why this is very bad and illegal by international law. So switching over to Presbyterian perspectives, I'm going to start in 2014, then backtrack a little to history, and then come up to this year, 2022. So in 2014, that was the 221st General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA, and they were meeting in Detroit, Michigan, and they voted to divest church funds from American companies that profit from Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory. That's a very nuanced statement, and I'll break down some of the little phrases in that statement, but you see the close vote. This passed by 7 votes in a body of 613 people. 310 people voted for it, 303 voted against it. And the way it got spun in this religion news service is that this vote marks a victory. It's not a very glowing victory when it's a win by 7 points, a victory for divestment supporters both within and without the PCUSA. And the PCUSA is now the largest American church to embrace divestment, although I'd say that's a contested embrace, as a strategy to pressure Israel to return its illegally held lands. So the pressure is that Israel would leave the occupied territories and give back their lands. I want to talk about that profit from Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories. American companies, right? So I'll break that down by backtracking, actually. It started in 2004. 10 years earlier, the first divestment overture came to the Presbyterian denomination, and this started the divestment debate. In that General Assembly, the PCUSA agreed to the following. Refers to the Mission Responsibility Through Investment Committee, MRTI, refers to them with instructions to initiate a process of phased, selective divestment in multinational corporations operating in Israel in accordance to General Assembly policy on social investing, and to make appropriate recommendations to the General Assembly Council for action. So they're saying, we're not divesting from Israel, we're not divesting everything, we're not divesting now. It's phased, it's not now. So the phased aspect is the MRTI, the Mission Responsibility through Investment Committee, connects with a corporation like Caterpillar that provides bulldozers that destroy Palestinian homes, like communications, Motorola for their communications in the occupied territories that enable military action, and there was a third one. So they reach out to these corporations and say, hey, do you know your products are being used in these illegal and hurtful ways? And then they have a dialogue with them, and they try to get the company to acknowledge that their products are being used illegally and immorally, and agree to not let their products be used in that way. And if that happens, there's no divestment. But so that's the phased aspect. But if they don't agree, they don't see it, it gets stronger and stronger until the point when we would pull our pension funds out of investments in their corporation. That's phased. Selective, because it's just targeting these 3 corporations for now. And again, it's not and never was meant to like divest everything from anything Israeli. It was phased, it was selective. But when it hit the news, it sure didn't feel that way to Jews. Who have had boycotts and throughout their history. This was the beginning. Boycotts happened before the Holocaust began. Boycotts happened before many, many pogroms throughout the world. So all these subtleties of, well, it's phased, well, it's selective. They just heard divestment, oh my goodness, and it was a firestorm. This debate, or this overture also said, that it reiterates and reaffirms the call of last year, 2003 General Assembly, on the Israeli government, calling the Israeli government to end the occupation now, asserting that, and I don't know if this was in the 2003 document or if this was just added here in 2004, said that the occupation must end. It has proven to be at the root of evil acts committed against innocent people on both sides of the conflict. So, trying to remember what I have coming up here. Oh, I have this slide here twice, apparently. Okay. So, this also was like a trigger for the Jewish community, because this idea that Jews are at the root of evil is one of the classic anti-Semitic things that's put out against them. The pictures caricature them as looking like Satan. They're the root of evil acts, and then evil acts are made up, like Jews are taking the blood of Christian boys because they need to use the blood to make their Passover crackers. You know, like just extreme classic anti-Semitism. Jews are at the root of evil. We got to get rid of the Jews, and then the evil will go away. And the second thing, that their evil acts are at the root not only of the harm they're doing to Palestinians, but somehow their own evil acts are at the root of attacks on them. So they're responsible for Hamas, they're responsible for Hezbollah, they're also responsible for what they're doing to the Palestinians, they're responsible for it all. So the people who wrote this, I'm sure, weren't thinking about it in that way. But this is an example of how we can stumble back into classic, historic anti-Semitism without knowing it if we don't study and know how anti-Semitism has worked throughout the world. So that was 2004. Lots of talk. Language in new overtures is somewhat improved. 10 years later, we got the divestment overture. And this was the stated meaning that was written in the overture, that we support a two-state solution. We're for both sides. That divestment is according to the MRTI policy. It's not political leverage. It's not to try to get Israel to act a certain way. It's because we want our money to be used ethically. That's our MRTI policy, mission responsibility through investment. And we stated in the document, this is not linked to the international BDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, because we saw that there are some problems with that international movement. And there was a lot of debate about this at the assembly. And I'll talk a little more about it, I think, in a future slide. So it's not linked to BDS. This is just our own thing, based on our morality. And it urges constructive communal relations, positive investment, not just divestment. It added stuff about how we should be investing in peace. And a lot of that came out of this church and the work of John Buchanan, that we're not just divesting from Israel, we're investing in Israel and Palestine. It had that stated meaning, but symbolically, it took on this meaning, which we saw in that newspaper article. It associates the divestment overture with political leverage to try to force a reaction from the Israeli government. So we were a little insincere, or we were in disagreement as a body when we put the language in there that we don't want to use this to pressure Israel. And the symbolic meaning also does associate divestment with the BDS movement, which that article clearly did right away. And it raises the question of the one-state solution, an end to Israel as a Jewish homeland. This was symbolic. This was what it felt like to some people. Here are the companies. Hewlett-Packard was the other one that I forgot. So here is, I'm not going to read all this language. All of it is so complex. You can read it. It just takes time. But that blue one at the end was added in the 11th hour during the debate. This action on divestment is not to be construed or represented by any organization of the PCUSA as divestment from the State of Israel or an alignment with or endorsement of the global BDS movement. That statement being added got enough votes to tip it over. Because the people who were worried about this, who said, there's a lot of problems with the BDS movement. There's a lot of people there who do want Israel to disappear. We don't want to affiliate with that. So by saying, okay, we'll just say we're not. But we did the divestment thing. So now we're part of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Symbolically, it still has that effect. So this sentence was in there. This is the newspaper interpreting this, and I'd have to go back and read that whole 2 or 3 page document to see what does it actually literally say. This is what the newspaper said, that this was a strategy to pressure Israel to return its illegally held lands. But which lands are illegally held? And this is something that we have to be very clear about within ourselves and in our conversations, and we're probably going to disagree about it. But for people who think that Israel is a colonialist enterprise, some people think that all of Israeli land is illegally held, that these are colonists who've come in to steal the land from Palestinians. So we recently had a debate within the Chicago Presbytery about an overture that was proposed to go forward. And, we had to talk about how Israel is occupying the Palestinian territories. And there's problems there. We need to address that. But Israel is not occupying Israel. So that's where this is really important. How we talk about it matters. So now 2022. There's a committee at the GA called the General Assembly Committee on Ecumenical and Interfaith Relations, GACER. And GACER is sending a document to GA this summer, a study document on denouncing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. A version of this was submitted in 2020, a shorter version, but it never got taken up because it was COVID and there was a ton of business that they just couldn't even deal with in 2020. I was like a consultant to the team writing this paper. So I was part of writing this paper. I'm not a member of GASER, I'm a writing consultant, writing team member. In 2020, we had like a sentence about Israel. And we said, you know, we know it's complicated about Zionism and anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, but we're not going to take this up right now. That was a little bit, I mean, we were scared, you know, in 2020. And we just didn't have time to work it out and run drafts by all of our partners, you know. But now we did. So this year we had a chance to resubmit it with edits. And so we added parts about Zionism and anti-Zionism and their relationship to anti-Semitism. This document is now public at that link at PCBiz. And it's on the handout if you want to look and read it. So this study document, I'll say first before I read this goes straight, I pulled out the paragraph on Zionism, but it's addressing a lot of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia too. Two things that are on the rise throughout the world, lots more violence. We addressed all that in 2020. And we're still addressing that in this study document. We want churches to talk about it and study it. We added this and some following. So some believe that criticism of Zionism is never anti-Semitic because it is criticism of a political system, regardless of Jewish involvement in that system. You have to be able to critique governments, right? Others believe that criticism of Zionism implies criticism of the very existence of a Jewish homeland. Some people believe that and feel that. And they believe that criticism of Zionism carries an embedded lack of concern for the survival and flourishing of the Jewish people, or worse, a desire for their destruction. So some criticism of Zionism, I have to say some criticism of Zionism does have that intent. Not all criticism of Zionism. So how do we figure out how to do that, how to criticize government actions and still affirm both peoples? The Merriam-Webster Dictionary, this is from the study document, defines anti-Zionism as, quote, opposition to the establishment or support of the state of Israel. And that is one of the ways that people hear anti-Zionism. We're anti-Zionist. I'm anti-Zionist. Oh, okay, you're against the establishment of Israel. You're against the support of the state of Israel. That's a real definition that we need to take seriously. And this definition is more than criticism of policies and practices or forms of government. So to some people, the definition of anti-Zionism is to be against the existence of Israel. We have to find a way to talk about that. A rabbi friend of mine here in Chicago said that to me. You have to understand, when we hear someone say they're anti-Zionist, we hear that they're against the survival of Israel. So in writing this document, we went to this, and we quote this document in the Presbyterian study document, the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. It's hard, you don't have to read that little tiny text, but this is a picture of their website, jerusalemdeclaration.org. We went here, this document, the Jerusalem Declaration, the JDA, I'll call it, the JDA, says their goal is providing clear guidance to identify and fight anti-Semitism while protecting free expression. You have to be able to critique governments, including the Israeli government. So the JDA defines anti-Semitism this way. It's discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews because they're Jews, or Jewish institutions because they're Jewish institutions. The declaration, the JDA, then goes on to give guidelines and examples for nuanced and contextual identification of anti-Semitism that takes into account who's saying it, what the situation is in which they're speaking, and the intention behind what they're saying. These are hard things to determine. But they give some examples, and they say, like, if someone expresses hostility toward Israel, it could be anti-Semitic, could be, maybe. But it could also be a reaction to a human rights violation. If you perceive that it's the Zionists who are doing this to you and you have hostility to the Zionists, that's a legitimate reaction to a human rights violation. Or that hostility could be an emotion that a Palestinian person feels on account of their experience at the hands of the state, their cumulative experience. They have the key to their grandparents' house, you know, they saw their family member killed or their brother in detention, you know, like cumulative experience at the hands of the state. These can all be things behind an expression of hostility that aren't necessarily anti-Semitic, but are embedded in the context of experience in a country that is having basically a kind of war. There's probably some reason I shouldn't use the word war, I don't, but you know, this violent conflict. So from the study document also, now talking about the JDA, this is really a quote from the JDA, that anti-Semitism includes applying symbols, images, and negative stereotypes of classical anti-Semitism to the state of Israel. So we saw an example of that. Jews are the root of evil. Get rid of the Jews, no more evil. Holding Jews collectively responsible for Israel's conduct. That's when a kosher grocery store in the United Kingdom gets wrecked because Israel took some action against Palestinians that made the news, and somehow this Jewish kosher deli is responsible. Holding Jews collectively responsible, that is anti-Semitic. Requiring people because they are Jewish publicly to condemn Israel or Zionism, for example, at a political meeting, that's so specific, you know it's happening. That is happening. Jews at meetings get confronted, well, what do you think about Israel? What, you don't renounce Israel? They're not responsible for the actions, and they love their homeland, even if Israel is doing illegal and human rights abuses things, like they shouldn't publicly have to renounce evil, renounce human rights abuses, not evil. See how easy that slipped in my mouth? Okay, these are two new bullet points. So anti-Semitism includes assuming that non-Israeli Jews, Jews throughout the world, are necessarily more loyal to Israel than to their own countries. Well, where does your loyalty really lie, you American Jew? You love Israel more than you love the United States, or whatever. These kinds of accusations, anti-Semitic. Denying the right of Jews in the state of Israel to exist and flourish collectively and individually as Jews in accordance with the principle of equality. To deny them the right to exist, to say that they should be wiped out, that it should be Palestine from the river to the sea. This is also anti-Semitic. So many of these things are on the rise around the world, and I have an example in Chicago of where something came up with the gay pride flag. This is actually a picture of flags from the San Francisco Pride Parade. The issue in Chicago was with a pride parade called the Dyke March. It's a smaller march that happens the day before the Pride Parade, and the organizers of that march say that their march, the Dyke March, is more inclusive and more socially justice oriented than the Pride Parade, which has taken, the Pride Parade has taken on a tone of like all the politicians and all the companies are all saying, hey, you're welcome if you're gay. So the Dyke March is saying we're more about social justice. But what happened in 2017 is some Jewish women came with flags that had the Star of David on them, that represented their Jewish identity and their gay pride, and the organizers asked them to leave the parade and said that the rainbow flags with the Jewish symbol, quote, made people feel unsafe. One of the organizers of the parade told that to a gay Windy City Times, a Chicago journal. The Jewish symbol made people feel unsafe. And the woman who was told to leave said that she was told to leave because her flag was a trigger to people that they found offensive. So for being Jewish, for representing Jewishness in public, not allowed to participate in a social justice march. In our local dialogues with Jews here, we talked one day about wearing religious symbols, jewelry, a little Star of David, a little cross. And Jews in our local dialogue reported feeling more and more scared to wear Jewish jewelry, where people could identify them as a Jew. This is anti-Semitism creeping and making Jews around the world more afraid. And that's wrong. How do we address that? Like, we don't address it by never calling Israel to account for Israel's wrongs. We have to do that. But we have to make clear that this isn't Jews or a Jewish way of being that therefore all Jews have. So some people like the JDA because not only does it say what's anti-Semitic, it also says what's not anti-Semitic, and that's really important too. They say that there are some things that are not anti-Semitic on the face of it, which is an interesting little loophole that we'll talk about. On the face of it, just supporting Palestinian demand for justice and full grant of their political, national, civil, and human rights, that's not anti-Semitic. Supporting them, that's not anti-Semitic. Evidence-based criticism of Israel as a state, here are the statistics, here are the human rights abuses, here's the proof, here's the evidence. We gotta respond to that. That's not anti-Semitic. Additionally, criticizing or opposing Zionism as a form of nationalism, criticizing this form of government, or advocating for different forms of government, whether it's a two-state solution, a binational state, a unitary democratic state, a federal state, or in whatever form, it's not anti-Semitic to talk about the political organization of the state. And they say boycott, divestment, and sanctions are commonplace, nonviolent forms of political protest against states. They're not anti-Semitic on the face of it. We tried to work that into our overtures and make our overture be not anti-Semitic by some of the things we added to it. But the symbolic meaning, we couldn't diffuse the symbolic meaning of that. But on the face of it, boycott, divestment, and sanctions is what we do as political people. Jews do that too in their social justice movements. But they have their general guidelines that are about just classic anti-Semitism. So these things that are not anti-Semitic on the face of it become anti-Semitic when general anti-Semitic things get used in those ways. So making sweeping generalizations, stereotypes about Jews, that they're wealthy, stingy, unpatriotic, a source of evil, or a source of disease like COVID, or through pictures of them, like making them look like Satan or whatever, And these ideas or images can be explicit or suggestive, and they give an example that portraying Israel as the ultimate evil or grossly exaggerating its actual influence can be a coded way of racializing and stigmatizing Jews. The Zionists then take the place of the Jews in stereotyped images. So these are the things we have to wrestle with when we're analyzing our own documents, when we're thinking about the words we use as we work for justice. Finally, I'm going to go back to 2014. I'm kind of starting to wrap up so we can have a little conversation. The 2014 overture, which wasn't called a divestment overture, by the way, it was called something like Working for Peace in the Middle East or something. It just had that divestment section. But it also had this: urge all church institutions to give careful consideration to possible investments in Israel-Palestine that advance peace and improve the lives of Palestinians and Israelis. And this church has investments for that reason, because of this. And this is in here partly because of the work of this congregation and our pastor emeritus, John Buchanan. I think I'm going to end it there. So we have 10 minutes or so for a little conversation. I could show you more slides and quotes, but I think I'm going to stop sharing and go into a discussion format. So that was a lot. I probably should have had a slide that just gave highlights of what we just talked about. Woo! Yes.
Are anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism the same?
No.
Because you switched halfway through the description, you changed to anti-Semitism from anti-Zionism.
In one of the slides or in one of the documents or in my language?
Going through the descriptions, it transitioned.
Well, what I'm trying to say is sometimes anti-Zionism can become anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism can be done. Critique of Zionism, let me call it critique of Zionism, can be done in an anti-Semitic way. Sometimes they're the same thing. Maybe you're thinking about where I said, this is a quote from the study document, the Zionists take the place of the Jews in the anti-Semitism. I can go back and try to find that slide.
Would it be comparable to comparing Christianity in general with the Crusades? The Crusades are more like Zionism, which is a facet of Judaism, perhaps?
Interesting. I don't think it would quite be like that. I'm trying to figure out if it was a slip of my tongue or if I was actually trying to make a point.
Well, Zionism really the government, not the religion.
Right. Yes. Zionism is the government. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Exactly. Yeah. But then people get that religious anti-Semitic judgment into critiques of those government identities. I saw Jim first and then Les. Can you hear the question, Ken or Linda? No. Okay. I'm going to repeat the questions from now on. What's your name?
David.
David was asking me if anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and I was trying to make distinctions between aspects of that. We might have to come back to it and keep talking about that some more. Jim.
The idea of Zionism sort of predated World War I, correct?
Yes.
So even that's a part of the, I don't know much about it, but that it was discussed as a destiny for Jewish people to have a homeland. So even before physically it happened or military, it became that way. It was a philosophy being discussed. So that's even meshes in even tighter.
Yes, very true. At least in the 1800s, for sure, they were starting to talk about that. And I think that had influence with some of the violence that happened in the early 1900s, the 1920, 1929 massacres and riots were related to fears about that.
Because it's on people's minds.
Yes.
And talked about it
Mm-hmm,
for a couple generations.
Yes, yes. Les.
So if a person is against the settlements that have been built in the West Bank, the occupied territory, are you an anti-Zionist or an anti-Semitic or anti-Semitism?
Or anti-settler.
Whoops. No, it's not anti. You could be anti-settler, but you're also. Is it the Zionist state that has been allowing building the settlements in the occupied territory?
Yes, yes, it is. Okay, the question is, if you're anti-settler, are you anti-Zionist or anti-Israel? I mean, to be the settlements and the settlers are allowed by the Israeli government, and they should not be allowing it. So if you have that critique, which is a legitimate internationally recognized critique that these settlements are illegal, to be against those settlements is to have a critique of the Israeli government. Some people think that's what anti-Zionism is. They might say, I'm anti-Zionist because I have these critiques of the Israeli government. But I'm trying to make a distinction that what you really have is a critique of the Israeli government. People can define themselves any way they want, I guess, but I don't think you have to say you're anti-Zionist if you critique Israeli policies. Because you're not critiquing the existence of Israel, you're critiquing the practices and policies of Israel. So I'm kind of saying that a definition of anti-Zionism is to be against the existence of Israel. To many people, that's what anti-Zionism means. I would like us all to start using it in that way. I think it would be more clear and concise. Nanette, am against policies and practices of the Israeli government, but I'm not against the existence of Israel. So I'm not an anti-Zionist, but I have a lot of serious critiques of Israel and their practices and policies. Yes.
So I can say I believe Netanyahu is a bully. I can say that without feeling guilty. Yes.
It's not anti-Semitic to critique people's actions and their behaviors.
It may depend who you say it to, though. They may take it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you say it to his face. Yeah. What else? Les?
I don't
Okay.
want to take up too much time.
I'll give you this one.
Historically, when we talk about a land of Israel, but you go back to the early maps, pre-British Mandate and all this stuff, and they say this is the land God gave us. When we see these old maps, Israel was one little piece, Judah was another piece, Samaria was a piece. There were, I don't know if that was the 12 tribes, whatever. So how is it that Israel isn't just the little piece of Israel? Why did it suddenly get all of it?
It's a great question on why the boundaries that Israel has. And I think, yeah, the British mandate, the British and the French carved up that region after World War I. You know, I wonder the same question, why that land? I don't have the same feeling of it being little bitty in the biblical maps. There was the kingdom of Judah, and there was the kingdom of Israel, which was sometimes called Samaria. And it's the west.
I've seen a map where Israel,
Well,
Judah,
there's a lot of
Samaria.
maps. Yeah.
That's why the Sumerians were not accepted by Jews.
They were enemies. I'm thinking of Samaritans, not Sumerians.
Maybe I'm getting.
Okay, yeah, that's true about the Samaritans. But what is now the West Bank used to be called Judah and Samaria, the whole West Bank. So Pastor Nanette, I'm wondering, like, why wasn't Judah and Samaria made Israel and the other land made Palestine? I don't have the answer to that. I wasn't in the room where it happened. When that decision was made by the British and the French and the British mandate came out. It doesn't seem like Jews were part of that conversation, but I don't know. That's just me conjecturing.
That, mandate by British, they came from the Bible, in the Old Testament. The verses here, they're all over, pointing to the fact Israeli country is going to be established in the green area of wherever, it comes from the Bible, doesn't it?
Are you talking about, there's not really talk about nation states or the development of a nation state. I mean, there's the people going through the Exodus to the Promised Land. Is that what you're thinking of, maybe?
No, I think there's other specific places in Old Testament pointing, there's a place in the currently Israeli area that's going to be the land of Israel, a place where the Israeli people are going to live.
I don't think so. I don't think so. If you can find a reference to that, I would love to see it and read about it. So you let me know, okay? Yeah, I'm not aware of that. Marilyn, did you have a question or a comment?
I was just wondering why the PCUSA even had the audacity to stick their nose into what I think is a political issue, and it's just a hotbed of stuff. You have no idea the abuse that I've gotten from my Jewish friends that I belong to an organization that's anti-Semitic and on and on and on. It's like I can't even calm them down. It's been a horrible experience for me. I happen to agree with the Jews. I don't think we should have gotten into this. Can you give us any justification? What was Reverend Buchanan's justification for us diving into this deep end, which is horrible? I've got cyanide right down the street here. It's embarrassing.
Believe me, I do know what it feels like. Yes, for the people online. Marilyn is asking, why does the PCUSA have the audacity to get involved in this issue? And that she has received a lot of criticism from Jewish friends about the Presbyterian Church being anti-Semitic. And we do have that reputation nationally, I would say. That's me, not Marilyn. Just affirming that. And so why did we get involved? And specifically, why did John Buchanan get involved? So there's different answers to different parts of your questions. We Presbyterians are involved in the political happenings in this region because we care about this region, because we are responsible for this region in the sense that it's the cradle of our faith. That's one of the documents we have, that Christianity began here. We're involved in this because there are human rights injustices, human rights abuses going on in the occupied territories. And we're not only involved here, we're involved in many other places around the world. We have missionaries and Christian pacemaker teams and people who go to different areas to try to defend people who are being harmed. So that's the initial reason, I think, of getting involved, that we see harm. We have Christian partners there who, Arab Palestinian Christians who are our brothers and sisters in Christ and who call out to us to take a stand, to care and to do something. That's the big getting involved. Why this church got involved is because the way we got involved had some anti-Semitic language in it. And so this church and John Buchanan has strong relationships with the Jewish community, and it came to his attention that this language, this anti-Semitic language, was embedded in what we were doing. And so his involvement, I think, was to try to make it more balanced, to try to represent to the Jewish community that not all Presbyterians are anti-Semitic, although maybe some of us are, and some of us are kind of not knowingly using language that references stuff that we haven't been aware of, and we need to get better and study that. So I think John got involved to bring more balance to it, specifically in relationship to our Jewish neighbors and partners. We have a very strong Jewish dialogue here that's actually, John had a longer one with Sinai and other partners, but in 2004, boy, we initiated one here. And we've had an ongoing dialogue with the Jewish community here. I mean, they kind of initiated it with us in their reaction. Alan Dershowitz, after the 2004 overture hit the papers, Alan Dershowitz, a Jewish lawyer, pretty well known, wrote an op-ed piece in the Los Angeles Times that said, Presbyterians have sold their soul to the devil. And I was a young pastor, just ordained 2 years earlier, and all of a sudden all the Jews I was encountering were saying, Presbyterians hate Jews. And it was painful and shocking. But the reason we were involved is because other painful, shocking things are also happening there in the region, and we care about that. We just need to do it. We just need to think about how we talk about it, and we need to think about it being a conflict between two peoples, and there's not one root source of evil in this conflict.
Is PCUSA divested from other companies where their profits are contributing towards humanitarian crises and things like that? I mean, are they being consistent across the board?
Yes, the Mission Responsibility through Investment Committee has lots of policies about where we do and don't invest. Like, we don't invest in alcohol. We don't invest in, I'm pretty sure we don't invest in military activities in general. Yeah. Ammunitions and
so wouldn't that be a basis to say that this is not an anti-Semitic stance? It's more of it's a humanitarian or social justice effort.
Absolutely, and that's what we were trying to do. But to do that but that's where I got the stated meaning, symbolic meaning. The stated meaning was that We're just doing this because we don't invest in ammunitions, munitions, war stuff. And although Motorola is a communications company, actually it's helping in, war efforts. And the Caterpillar was a very controversial one because the Caterpillar Corporation is nearby us somewhere, and they make tractors. We're going to disinvest from tractors? Well, because they provide military armored tractors that go in and bulldoze Palestinian homes. So we had to make the links of how these were military connected corporations. But symbolically, if you're going to make that kind of distinction, like I do think we can make that kind of distinction. I'm sorry, I didn't interpret that for you online. Those of you online, did you pick up what we were talking about? Okay. When you think about, I want to just talk for a second. I guess we're over time, so we should be ending soon. I'll just say one more thing. When you have no relationship with the Jewish community and they see you take a stand that looks very similar to other stands that have led to their demise, they're not going to trust you. But if you have a strong relationship with them and they know you and they know that you love and affirm them and their existence and their flourishing and that you care about anti-Semitism, and you need to make a stand like, we need to divest from Motorola and Hewlett-Packard, and we still love you, but we need to, they're going to trust it more because you have a relationship with them. And the PCUSA has not been able to sustain our relationship with the Jewish community at the national level. And I'm not saying it would have been easy, but when all this hit the fan, fracturing happened. And many of us in local areas, and Chicago in particular, has kept and strengthened and grown that partnership. And there are many, many more Jews who now know that not all Presbyterians hate them. Not all Presbyterians are anti-Semitic. Because there's trust and relationship and knowing. And we have to keep talking with them and learning how to talk with them and each other about the human rights injustices that are happening and how they need to be addressed. But it's real hard to tease out when all these other narratives are coming down and people are repeating. And more people and more Christians are repeating the idea that Israel is outsider colonialists coming in and taking advantage of the indigenous Palestinian people. And as more Christians say that, more churches, it becomes harder and harder to address the conflict even, because it becomes filled with hatred and fear and trauma and re-triggering traumas. So relationships, and sometimes those of us who are attending to relationships with Jewish partners, again, are told, as I've said, well, you must not care about the Palestinians. Well, I care about both. And this is really hard.
Before we close, I just wanted to thank you so much for your scholarship,
Yes.
your balanced presentation of this really complicated issue, and your facilitation skills. And I think you've done a great job.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm going to call on Jim one more time.
And I'll point out that our May 3rd, First Tuesday book discussion is on the book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, and that will be leading that. So that's about 5 weeks away.
Yeah.
It's a quick read and really pretty stimulating and fascinating.
How to Fight Anti-Semitism. It talks about anti-Semitism in the far right, anti-Semitism in the Islamic world, anti-Semitism in the far left, which was new for me.
Yeah.
Like, I never thought about left-leaning people being anti-Semitic. So, yeah, check it out. Thank you all so much. It's been great to be with you. Bye.